Notre prochain présentateur, on avait une série d'étoiles montantes, des chercheurs, chercheuses plus en début de carrière. La prochaine est plutôt une étoile. Our next presenter is Brian Leung. He's a quantitative ecologist and modeler from McGill University. He's going to talk to us about his different projects, his research programs. Take the stage.
All right, thank you very much. The last talk was actually a great segue into mine. So clearly I'm not a new professor, but I am new to CEF, and primarily because I started collaborating with Dan and with Patrick James, which brought me actually back to Canada as well to start doing research here again. And so what I focus on is predictive modeling, and I'm not going to talk about my history because I've been around for a while. I'm going to focus on forests in the Americas and kind of give a suite of examples of the kind of research that kind of goes on in my lab and how we think about things. Right, so basically it's a good time to be a modeler, much like the last talk was talking about. The amount of information which is available to us to answer the questions that are important and of interest has increased dramatically and continues to increase. And this includes the things such as the remote sensing. It includes all sorts of environmental conditions. It also includes biodiversity estimates, so species records, ways of estimating height or the growth of species, and also because humans are such major drivers of how things change, we also have massive data sets on things to do with people, economics, right, trade, movement of people. So all these different things we can use to essentially build our models, and that's great, but it turns out that trying to interpret this data can actually be kind of nuanced and challenging. And how to interpret or understand our observations, of course, pretty central to science. Right, so what I want to do today is just to organize the talk a little bit. I'm going to just separate it arbitrarily into several themes. Of course, they're not mutually exclusive. I'm going to start with patterns, drivers in society. So patterns, I'm going to talk about 2 projects for each one, and I'm going to try to keep it about 1.5 minutes for each one. All right, so patterns, I'm going to talk about species distributions as well as forest growth. For drivers, I'm going to then go and focus on pests, and I'm talking about both invasive pests as well as native pests, and I'm talking about population dynamics as well as spread of species. And finally, I'm going to talk about society, right? So one of the main things about why we care about all these things is because of the economics, and so I'll talk about some of my early work on bioeconomics. Right, for each one, I'm going to talk about the study system a little bit and why it's kind of interesting. I'll talk about some of the current ways of thinking about things and what some of the major issues are, and then what I think are some of the coolest elements of what the research kind of brings to the table and how it advances the science in those areas. So first, what I want to do is let's go to Panama. And Panama is awesome because, well, McGill has been there for well over 20 years now. We know lots of people there. It's a major center of biodiversity. It's a biodiversity hotspot. And so what we want to do here is we want to estimate the distributions of 6,000 plant species, right, using species distribution models, which I'm sure lots of people have heard about. And so there's lots of data to do so. There's all these sighting records, right? So basically there's this database of records such as GBIF, but these are heavily, heavily biased to the point where some people are thinking you shouldn't even use them at all. But it turns out we also have other survey data that takes into account all the species records in that location and is much more systematic, and we can use those. So they have measured about 1,500 species, and there's about 6,000 species that we can use to extrapolate to. And because it's biased, we can think about generating these biased kernels using spatial factors like environment, human, distance to road, for example, as well as species factors, so species traits, as well as web analytics. Don't worry about that. Right, to try to correct for those things. So just to give you some of the talking points associated with the take-home messages, if we build a naive species distribution model, which arguably people still do, a little bit less now, it's a little bit better, but when we build those for these species, you can be about 4,000% underestimation. But it turns out we can actually correct for that very simply by calibrating it against those surveys, right, to correct that underestimation, and then we can go even further by using those species traits and the spatial traits to increase our predictive power by twice compared to the other corrected model. So that's great. And we can use this model as our baseline and estimate biodiversity hotspots for where development may occur, so where there may be conflict. We can estimate, diversity in indigenous areas where there's virtually no sampling done in Panama, right? So all these different things. All right, so now I want to move down south a little bit more to Brazil, and this is the work by one of my graduate students, Ana Villa, who's passionate about Brazil and about environmental issues. And here what we're interested in is forest regrowth in the Brazilian Amazon and trying to understand that because, of course, it's going to be important for climate change. So people, of course, have studied this before, but they've looked at essentially growth or biomass accumulation over time, but they've been using often aggregate measures and looking at median values. And my student was interested in what happens can we predict what happens at the plot level? And when we look at the plot level, those previous ways of analyzing it explain about 10% of the variation. If we incorporate neighborhoods of the surrounding forest, which was the main predictive factor, as well as local context such as environmental conditions, previous land use histories, that jumps up by about fourfold, so to about 42%. Another interesting thing about this that we found was that the model suggested there was actually a 25-year lag between when the forest was estimated to regrow using those remote sensing products versus when our model actually suggested it did regrow. And that seems like a long time, but when we actually compared it against the plot level data where they're actually measuring regrowth, it actually fits very well those black dots associated with it. And if we use the null model that does not take into account this lag phase, you get the yellow line, which is far off. Right, so we thought that was actually really cool. All right, so now I'm going to move back to Canada, which, was in collaboration with Dan and with Patrick. And my student, Morgane Henry, led all this stuff, and you may have seen her talk before, so I'm just going to really briefly kind of recap some elements for those of you who haven't. So this is focusing on spruce budroom dynamics, and we're going to focus on Lee effect. So Lee effects are super important. It's basically positive density dependence, where the growth rate may be positively related to population size. So what that means is underneath a certain level, that population may just be more prone to go extinct. And so it's very, very important for things such as management. So the cool thing about this is that we actually had a database with 1,000 populations that were estimated across 20 years, right? So we had these time series databases that we could actually analyze the population dynamics. And when we examined or tested for Lee effects using the best model we could generate, we could actually not detect it using this temporal analyses, okay? So this is potentially super important because in comparison with the current estimates, the current estimate is that what affects management is that the elite threshold is about 3.5 larvae per branch, right? However, this was based on a spatial analysis, right? And of course, it's not illogical that environmental conditions vary across space. Environmental conditions affect growth rates, right? And growth rates could easily affect population size, right? So the relationship might be reversed, and this may not indicate that there is actually a Lee effect, right? So we thought that was very neat. All right, so moving right along, I'm going to now move to the United States. And I'm going to think about invasive forest pests and spread. And I'm going to think about all of them, right? So we're going to see if we can build a model to estimate all the forest pests in the United States and how they should spread over time, right? And we're going to integrate here, again, environmental conditions, human conditions, and species traits as part of predictors that moderate the rate of spread. And it turns out that, yes, we can do all of this stuff. It turns out, actually, the spread rates are remarkably consistent across invasive species when you consider the ranges of the host plants, right? So even without considering any of their predictors, it's actually still pretty consistent. But forested area and human population density significantly affected those relationships as well. So the range size of prediction versus observed, quite strong, right? And this is the actual area estimated to be invaded in these different areas, and the locational predictions as well, quite good. All right, final topic, right? Now I want to talk about what actually brought me to forests in the first place, and this is because I was working in bioeconomics at the time, and so I was invited onto these projects that was trying to estimate the value of forest pests and the mitigation. So here we're looking at what's called pathway level economic risk analysis. And this was a multi-year project with lots and lots of people involved, trying to evaluate the benefits associated with policy and you know, how much damage these invasive species would cost. All right, and so we're going to focus on international standard for phytosanitary measures, ISPM 15. I don't know, many of you may have already heard about this. But this basically treats woodpacking material, which is a major entry point, major pathway into different places in the world, right? And it stops essentially or reduces wood-boring pests. And wood-boring pests we discovered in part of our analyses was one of the worst ones, right? So it's been implemented since about 2004. Many countries have been involved in it. Is it worthwhile, right? So to answer that question, it actually took a lot of different projects or pieces of the project. In one of them, we estimated the cost of the pests in the United States to be about $34 million on average, but most of them were innocuous. A few of them caused massive amounts of damage, so very asymmetric. The policies themselves, so that treatment, we could look at interception records to try to estimate how effective they were at reducing it, right? And it was about 52% effective. The cost, we built a model for the entirety of the United States and estimated the cost to be about $437 million to treat those wood pallets, and that is modified because, of course, economics, you know, they'll adjust their behavior to minimize the cost, right? So the cost of the actual strategy is about $900 million. So if you look at those numbers, you might look and think, well, that doesn't really look worthwhile. But when we actually brought it together and considered the growth of trade and the fact that species are accumulating and that the cost per species is also accumulating, right? It turns out that there's about $11.8 billion expected net benefit by 2050. Having implemented ISPM 15, which has been done already, we expect actually that we'll have averted more pests than currently are established in the United States. The benefits associated with it was first more costly, but then that turned around right around 2016, and the cumulative benefit is probably positive now since about last year, right? That said, the establishment projected are estimated to about triple, irrespective of the fact that we have this. Now, some of our more recent analyses suggest that we should revisit some of these numbers, and so that's actually one of the things I want to do because I'm not above critiquing my own work. All right, thanks.
Merci à tout le monde pour les présentations.